Spend a Winter in Hell by Caleb M. Powers. Read by the author. To my first patrons, Josh Vincent, Carly Pinch, and Ethan Stoltzfus. Manulf swore on his two good hands that he would send his children to hell. They had tried to kill him again, the foolish whelps. The first time it had been amusing, as had the second. After 6 attempts, Manulf had grown tired of the game. But this last try, this desperate, foolish move, bribing one of his favorite employees to betray him, they had gone too far. Manulf shook his head, feeling his aging bones creak as he stood up and started walking, leaving what was left of his former bodyguard behind. He wasn't in the mood to bother with a proper funeral for the man, and there wasn't much left of him anyway. The sounds of the forest were as they always were, the cawing of crows, the wind in the trees, the crunch of snow underneath Manulf's boots. No one, not even the earth herself, paused in remembrance of the man who had just been murdered. The only eulogy Atris received had been a fleeting moment of nervous silence from the trees, just after he had choked on his own blood. Manulf coughed up a bit of phlegm and spat, and that was the last he thought of Atris. He could not see the crows, or the trees, or the snow, as the darkness surrounding him was impenetrable, but he had been without his eyes for long enough to find his way through the forest by other means. His remaining senses had been made incredibly keen, but it was the Waldmight that let him walk as confidently as he did. He had traded his eyes for it, and had never regretted that decision. Except once. He was more powerful, though, even in his old age, than he had ever been as a young man. Never mind his weak body, that didn't matter in the slightest. Because of the Waldmight, everyone still feared him. His children had tried to kill him. They had let their greed or hatred for him overpower their fear. Their mistake, and thus, their consequences. Manulf flexed his fingers in anticipation as he felt a hot spot in the space around him. Yes, he should use it. Normally he would just walk, but he was alone, and he was eager to finish the task ahead of him. He plunged his hands into just the right location, not the cold, crisp air in front of him, but somewhere deeper that lay just beyond the breeze that danced before him, and pulled the space apart. A crack between the dimensions that lay folded together like the pages of a book split and widened, and Manulf smiled as he felt the rush of wind as the air around him was sucked into the emptiness he had opened. The expanse before him had no proper name. He was the only one who knew about it, but he had come to call it the Winds. A simple name, but he was a simple man. He stepped into the portal, a feeling of weightlessness overtaking him, and turned with an elegant spin. He pulled the crack closed again and then began to float in the void, letting the silent currents of energy take him home. Oh, how he loved it here. The winds held freedom, an endlessness that did not care if he was old or blind. He was in control. He decided where to go and what to do. Unlike the earth, which was cold and full of annoyances, the winds were entirely his own. Even the rumble of an approaching storm did not dampen his jubilance. The currents that carried him along started to flow faster and more haphazardly, but Manulf only smiled. Even when chaos swirled around him, threatening to drag him down, he was in control. Eventually, he would arrive at his destination and be forced to step back into the icy world. But for now, he floated. Manulf thought about Bjard, his hometown. It was his, like the winds were his. Every person in every house lived because he willed it. He was in control of their lives, their destinies. His business ran Bjard, just as it ran the rest of the country. His caravans sold everyone everything from here to the far side of the mountains. He had all the money he could ever want. And yet it was the control that he savored, not the wealth. The glorious feeling of absolute domination. It was the Waldmight that had given him that dominion. He was not an emperor or a king. He did not wear a crown, nor did he make official policies or give grandiose speeches. By most standards, he was just a man. He was, however, the man who ruled the world. There, Manulf thought, sensing that the hot spot he needed was ahead. The winds were roughly the same size as the real world, a dimension functioning parallel to his own, though infinitely easier to travel through. He simply rode the current in the direction he needed to go until he reached the spot parallel to his destination on the other side. He heard a distant rumble behind him. Yes, the storm was coming this way. He wondered if there would be a regular storm on the other side, too. He forced the crack open with his hands and spilled through onto the cold murderess they called the earth. He reluctantly closed the portal, though all he wanted to do was return, despite the coming tempest. Down that path lay madness, however. It was something Manulf had realized early on in his time with the Waldmite. If he stayed in the winds too long, he would never want to leave, and would begin to forget that anything outside the winds even existed. It was a dangerous fate to toy with, but Manulf had always been a dangerous man. The street he had come out of the winds onto was quiet. It was still relatively early in the morning, and Manulf strolled along its cobbled surface towards home, feeling the tap-tap of his boots beneath him. His children wouldn't be expecting any news about what had transpired in the woods for a few hours yet, and they definitely weren't expecting him to return, so this visit would be quite the surprise for them. For a fleeting moment, he wished he still had his eyes, if only to see the look on Vevin's face when his son saw him. But no, Manulf had something far better than eyes. His house lay before him. He couldn't see it, of course, but he could imagine it in his mind's eye quite plainly. A modest building, painted a dark red, old in design and feel. It stood on the lonely corner where two unimportant streets intersected. One would think the man with every person's fate for hundreds of miles in any direction in the palm of his hand would have more flattering accommodations. But that wasn't Manulf's style. He didn't need palaces or hordes of servants to be satisfied. He didn't need anyone at all for that. He walked until he knew he was in front of the thick oak door of the entrance. The Waldmite, in addition to letting him ride the winds, also gave him an innate sense of direction and spatial awareness. He knocked once, then twice. No one answered. He knocked again. He heard a stirring from inside. A second later, a voice mumbled from the other side of the portal. "Who is it? What do you want?" It was Olas, his eldest daughter. "Open the door, Olas," Manulf said. His voice was barely a whisper, yet behind it hid the force of 100 storms. "We need to talk." "Father? Is that you?" "Don't make me repeat myself, Olas." Manulf heard a lock turn, and the door creaked open. "Come in, Father." Olas stood just inside. Manulf imagined his tall, beautiful daughter just into her 30th year. He was told she was the spitting image of his late wife. Another reason to be thankful for not having eyes. "We didn't think you were going to be back so soon." Olas's voice was shaky, but she was handling herself rather well, considering. Manulf smiled. This was going to be so much fun. "Gather your brothers and sisters," the old man said, stepping in and hanging up his coat on the rack next to the door. He didn't need eyes or the Waldmite to remember exactly where the pegs were. "Atris is dead." And with that, he walked into the kitchen and proceeded tearing into a loaf of bread on the dining table. Olas scurried up the stairs behind him, and soon after he heard the muffled gasps and murmurs of the rest of his offspring. Manulf's smile remained as he ate the bread, savoring each bite and each whispered cry. He had always enjoyed the fear, the sense of control he could relish every time another person bowed down to his authority. He was a little bit of a megalomaniac that way, but he had lived with himself long enough to both recognize and accept these little flaws of his. Yet those sorts of flaws in others, now, that he couldn't accept. The sound of footsteps began as his children descended from the second floor. Olas, then Vevin, the eldest son, followed by Manulf's sons Jon, Bed, and Tornar, and lastly by little Uhtred, his second daughter and youngest child of 16 years. Manulf ignored them all, chewing on his bread as they filed into the kitchen. He could almost sense the anxiety, thicker than air as it swirled around them all. He let them drown in it for a few minutes, not saying a word as he continued to eat. They were all terrified, wondering what he would do next. This was the first time he had ever confronted them directly after one of these attempts. For all they knew, this was the first one he had ever found out about. They wouldn't dare speak out of turn lest they incur his wrath. That was at least one thing they had learned, unlike their mother. As you've all been made aware, Atreus is dead, Manulf said. I can't say I didn't see it coming, though. He was reckless and foolish. The greatest swordsman alive, yes, but a remarkably stupid man. Now, because of that stupidity, he is only the 27th greatest swordsman dead. He tried to kill me for some inexplicable reason, and so I had to kill him instead. It wasn't that hard, really. Nothing ever is when you're me. His children shuffled slightly. Maybe he doesn't know we were behind it, they were surely thinking. Maybe we got away with it again. Manulf laughed suddenly, a cold chuckle. Vevin, come here. Vevin stepped forward hesitantly. He was a big man, but with a soft voice. Yes, father? Your mother would be so proud of your treachery. Curse her name. I don't understand, Vevin said, as if testing the temperature of a hot spring with a careful foot. What do you mean, father? I mean, the only way I'm not going to stab you in the throat right now is if you give me the names of every single person who was involved in the planning or execution of the 7 different attempts on my life in the past 2 years. Do I make myself clear? The room was silent for a long moment. Manulf stood there, waiting for someone to respond to him, but also savoring the tense silence. Finally, Vevin spoke. You make yourself very clear, father, Vevin said. I promise you we had nothing. It was all Vevin and Olas, Uhtred blurted out. He tried to get us to betray you, but we refused. Manulf heard Vevin turn and strike his sister, sending her sprawling to the floor. Don't listen to that witch, father. You know she takes after mother. Manulf grimaced and gritted his teeth, his rage boiling in him like a volcano. Give me answers, Vevin, now. Vevin started again, but Uhtred started screaming from where she lay on the floor. It was just them, father! I can... Her last words degenerated into a gurgle of blood as Vevin drew his knife, leaned down, and slit her throat. Suddenly, as if all pretense had died with Uhtred, the rest of his children began to yell over each other, blaming one another incomprehensibly. Don't listen to them, father, Vevin yelled. I have always been... It was all Vevin, Olas screamed. It was all him! I didn't... Jon started. We could never, Bet begged. Silence! Manulf bellowed over the roar filling the kitchen. He stood to his feet. I will kill you all right now, every last one of you, unless you give me names. I want the head of anyone who has tried or planned to take my life. Any one of you who wishes to beg for mercy may do so. I may spare you. He was snarling now, so enraged that he was shaking. His idiotic, ungrateful, mongrel children, he wanted to wring every last one of their necks. One more moment of silence, and then Tornar yelled out some ridiculous battle cry from one of the stories Manulf's wife used to tell them. The boy drew his sword and charged Manulf, but the old man just shook his head. Always the impulsive one, Tornar. The old man waited until the last possible moment and then neatly sidestepped his young, athletic son, using the boy's own force to send him crashing into the table behind Manulf. The old man drew his own jagged-edged blade from its place at his side. What Tornar had in youth, Manulf had in experience. He kicked his son square in the head as he struggled to rise from the splintered wood of the kitchen table, and Tornar crumpled. With another step and a calculated slash, Manulf brought down Olas as well, who was screaming in terror. Jon and Bed were already running. Manulf grunted in disgust, took one step over Olas's injured body, and then reached into the empty air above him, tearing another hole open in the dimensions. Except this time, he didn't open a portal to the winds, but rather to hell itself. It was the most dangerous thing he could try, but he would not let his children get away with attempting to kill him again. They would all die, and if he loosed a demon, so be it. Sometimes he was selfish like that. Olas was the first to go. Manulf hefted her by her neck as she squirmed, her own blood covering her hands, slippery as she tried to pry his fingers off. He yelled out in rage and threw her into the gaping maw, where she fell screaming into the mass of bodies and flame. He spat once into the rift and turned to find his other children. And then he felt a searing pain as a blade narrowly missed his neck, instead slicing through his face and his empty eye socket. Manulf cried out in agony, and then anger, and then pure unholy hatred. Tornar, standing a step away with sword in hand, hesitated as Manulf began to advance on him, sputtering and growling like some ravenous beast. Tornar eventually took a swing at Manulf, but too late, as the old man was already too close and quickly knocked aside the clumsy swing. Manulf snarled and grabbed a fistful of his hair, yanking the boy's head down at the same moment he brought his knee up, smashing Tornar's face in. Then he was dragging the struggling boy toward the flames. Tornar tried to break his father's hold, grasping at Manulf's hand weakly, but Manulf ignored him and was soon at the edge of the portal. "Please," Tornar cried out, almost a broken sob. His face was bleeding and broken. "Mercy!" "I gave you a chance, and you spat on it. Curse you, child," Manulf snarled. "Go join your mother, dying 1,000 deaths in the pit." Tornar went out with even less dignity than his sister had, crying like a sick child as he plummeted into the charnel pit of broken souls. Manulf remembered that place keenly. The pain, the death, the fire. That was where he had lost his eyes. That was where he had died, and been reborn. Manulf turned, wiping at the trickle of blood on his face from where Tornar had cut him. He didn't have time to tend it right now. He had to finish this. Vevin. Where was Vevin? Jon and Bed had ran. Uhtred was probably already dead. Manulf took a step and felt something sticky. Yes, Uhtred was far dead. Her lifeblood was spilled all over the floor. It was going to take forever for that to come out of the wood. Curse them, all of his children. He should have killed them years ago, when he had killed their treacherous mother. They all came from the same rotten tree. He strained to hear if someone was in the room, while also trying to sense if there was anything out of the ordinary. His spatial awareness let him know where obstacles were, but didn't make out fine details. He knew the layout of the kitchen by heart, so... There. Vevin was right in front of him. How did... A sword swung. Manulf sensed the movement just a moment before it would have killed him, ducking and rolling out of the way, covering himself in Uhtred's blood. Manulf swore again as he felt the sticky substance clinging to his brand new shirt. He dipped, and then swung it where he sensed Vevin to be, to the right. He was met with a clang as his son blocked the blow. "You think you can just take all of my wealth, my entire business, through a coup?" Manulf screamed as he stumbled back out of reach of his son's swipe. "Haven't you learned anything from history, boy? An empire is weakest just after the emperor dies. If you're the one with a knife in your hand when I go to spend my winter in hell, you won't be the emperor. You'll just be the man who killed him." "I have my own supporters," Vevin snarled. He charged and swung, but Manulf blocked his son's blade with his own and then sent him sprawling back with a shove, knocking him off balance. "They will make sure that your authority doesn't go down with you." Manulf's brow furrowed, and he paused, holding his sword before them. "How long has this been in planning, Vevin? How many are involved?" Vevin breathed heavily and then laughed. "I've been planning this since Mother died. I promised her I'd end you for what you did to her." "What I did to her?" Manulf growled. "She really did have you all wrapped around her gnarled finger, didn't she?" "You're a monster," Vevin said. "But it doesn't matter, Father. None of this does. You won't live long enough to destroy anything more with your vitriol." Manulf did a quick analysis of the room in his mind's eye. Vevin was standing between him and the portal, filled with its demons and consuming fire. Luckily, nothing had noticed the leak and tried to find its way out into this world, but Manulf couldn't keep it open for much longer without risking discovery. And so, he charged, howling with fury, and slamming into Vevin with all the force he could muster. The boy barely brought up his weapon in time to stop Manulf's blade from tearing into his throat, but the force of the tackle sent both of them through the portal and into the flaming abyss. They fell for what seemed like an eternity, through smoke and ash and sulfur, until they crashed into the sea of bodies that lined the charred ground. Vevin hit first, smashing into one of the tormented and crushing her beneath his weight. Manulf didn't land any more gracefully. his ancient body creaking as he landed on a tormented and then grunted to his feet. The wretched souls all around them pulled back in terror and began crawling away, moaning in a continuation of their never-ending agony. Vevin seemed dazed for a moment from the fall, and so Manulf took advantage of the situation, snarling and swinging his jagged sword at his confused son. A deep, dark hatred burned inside of him. How dare this child, this whelp, treat him like this? Invoke his wife's name like she was some sort of saint? Vevin did not deserve to live for even a second longer. The swing of his blade was empowered by his rage, and had he connected, he would have surely severed Vevin's head from the rest of him. Unfortunately, he didn't connect. Vevin suddenly regained his balance and his clarity. Maybe he hadn't really lost it at all, and dodged out of the way of Manulf's too powerful swing, ducking under and away from his father. Then, with his own small, silvery sword, he cut off Manulf's hand at the wrist. Manulf felt a searing pain, and then a terrible weight settled on his soul. No, I need my hands. I need both of them to close the portal, to use the Waldmight. He had lost one of his hands. He had lost one of his hands. Manulf screamed, a blood-curdling, pain-racked scream, and then dove headfirst into Vevin's center of mass. They became a twisting pile of legs and arms, surrounded by the wretched souls of the dead with their own pale limbs, reaching, longing for something to release them from their pain. Manulf headbutted Vevin, and the boy was almost knocked out right there. But a second later, Manulf was howling and shoving his bloody stump of a hand down Vevin's throat. The boy choked and sputtered, but Manulf would not release him. Pinning him down with his body and holding his arms down with his one good hand and a foot, Manulf slowly choked the life out of his son with his bloody arm. Despite the searing pain at the stump of his wrist, despite the lump in the pit of his stomach as he thought about the loss of his hand, despite everything, this act of desperation, the murder of his child, helped him to feel in control again. He had almost lost it. But now it was here, with him, invigorating him. Sweet, wonderful control. He didn't need the Waldmight to have it. Hearing Vevin's dying gurgles, he knew in that moment that he had become king of the world not through the Waldmight, but because of himself. Only him. He was God, and he would not suffer this boy to live. So had been his holy decree. Vevin's eyes rolled back in his head as he passed out. Manulf grabbed the blade that still lay in the grip of his disembodied hand, wrenched it free, and then stabbed Vevin in the face. Not once, not twice, but 20 times. Over and over, until there was nothing left but an unrecognizable mass. Manulf got to his feet, still bleeding from where his hand had just been a moment ago, and ripped off a piece of cloth from Vevin's shirt, wrapping it as well as he could with one hand over his bloody stump. The hair on the back of his neck stood up, and with a chill, ironic because he was in hell, he remembered where he was, and who lived here. He whirled around and found him standing there. Tarwa, the being, the force of nature, the demon, who had given him the Waldmight.
You made a mistake, coming here again,
the demon said, voice deep and grating. Manulf didn't have his eyes anymore, but he didn't need them to see Tarwa before him. It had been the last image he had seen before his sight had been taken from him, and it was burned into his brain. In some ways, it had never stopped being before him, silently looming, waiting to take him back to this place. That image of Tarwa showed a hideous thing, a devilish black and red monstrosity that was the embodiment of the nightmares of generations of frightened children. He had a goat's head, scaly reptilian legs, and the clawed hands of some unknown beast. His forked, serpentine tongue danced and licked at the air. Scales, fur, and feathers seemed to meld together across his mottled skin. The masses of tormented around Manulf hissed and sputtered, trying to crawl away despite their debilitating torture.
I see you've lost a tool of the power I gave you, Tarwa said. And after all the trouble you went through to claim it, you should have been more careful.
Manulf could feel the demon reaching towards him, and he froze, motionless. Finally, a mere second before Tarwa's clawed hand touched him, he dove beneath the demon's legs, regaining his senses and snarling like a cornered animal. The demon lunged for him, but Manulf slid, the charred ground slick with his own blood. The old man scrambled away as fast as he could, back towards the portal, but stopped short when he realized that it lay dozens of feet into the air, suspended above the massive bodies covering the floor of hell. He was trapped. He couldn't even open another portal without both of his hands. He turned back towards Tarwa. Manulf frantically tried to think of some way to escape, some other portal, perhaps. He tried to reach out with his heightened senses. No, there was nothing. He had never met anyone else with the power of the Waldmight at their disposal. He wasn't entirely sure if there were others. How could he get away? How could he salvage this? Surely there had to be some way to save himself, to not die here.
What are you doing, mortal?
Tarwa sneered.
Surely you know there is no way out. You are blind and helpless, bereft of the Waldmight now, and surrounded by the tormented. You will join them, like I promised you those years ago, just as your pretty prize of a wife has. I will burn your tree in the Valgair soon. I can feel it withering as your lifeblood flows out.
Manulf felt terror. For the first time in years, he was mortified with the fact that he might die. It had been so long that he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to feel the weight of your own mortality. He clutched at his bleeding stump, wincing. This was the end. There was nothing he could do. The determination he had felt mere moments before seemed to drain away, and he felt exhausted. Why had he been fighting this? How could he not see this was coming? He licked his chapped lips and moaned softly as the sweet taste of his control and power slipped away from him, leaving him helpless. Tarwa stepped forward. Manulf felt the ground shake. The tormented wailed in terror.
It happened exactly as I saw, didn't it? Tarwa laughed. I wondered when I burned her tree. I told you that love that is bought does not last. But what did I know? I am merely a creature of hate. And yet how close hate and love are. How easy it is for one to turn to the other.
The king of the world began to watch his empire crumble around him. In his mind's eye, he could see it all fading away. The mountains across which his roads ran, then the roads themselves, then the caravans of wagons, the men who worked them, his family, his house. They all dissolved like sand before him. The ground itself caved in around him, till he was left with nothing but emptiness. Emptiness and the hollow hatred he still felt for his treacherous wife, who he thought he had loved. The feeling was still burned into him as permanently as the image of his undertaker was.
You have lost,
Tarwa breathed.
Everything. Your wife, your children, your very soul. You are powerless.
Manulf's breathing was ragged and broken as he took in the foul, smoky atmosphere around him. Yes, it was true. Or no. Manulf could still feel the vague warmth of the Waldmight in his chest, mingling with the smoke in his lungs. He could still sense the space around him, still feel the presence of other dimensions, other worlds, hidden just beneath the fabric of this one. He could still feel his one good hand. If he could just... Manulf reached out with his remaining hand and tore a hole in the fabric of existence. It was painful. Far more painful than he was expecting. He felt his remaining hand stretching, then shrinking, then ripping and tearing apart as he clawed a portal open to the winds. He cried aloud in a ragged breath as he pried the tapestry of space back like the peel of a fruit, his hand peeling off his body along with it and tossed into some faraway nothingness. He felt some of the heat of his surroundings disappear as air blew from the portal, probably extinguishing some of the fires. The tormented moaned in fear around him. Manulf tried to fix the portal's size, but with both hands now gone, he couldn't properly separate the dimensions. He cursed and roared, straining at the pain in his hand as he struggled to keep the portal open for just a moment longer. Behind him, Tarwa roared in anger and surprise. Manulf jumped through the portal into the winds, and he was carried off by a sudden, violent gust of wind. The fires, the tormented, and even Tarwa faded into the distance as he lost all sense of direction, tossed to and fro. The storm he had felt coming earlier in the winds was here in full force now, throwing him about like a kite in a tornado. Unlike a regular storm, which would have been filled with flying debris, a storm in the winds was just a force of pure energy and movement. That was enough, however, to nearly rip Manulf in half as he struggled to gain some control on where he was going. Without his hands, he could not guide himself along the currents of rushing air as he once did. He was nearly helpless, skipping like a stone across a lake, being pulled inexorably onward by the storm's front. And then, it stopped. The storm had thrown him clear of its driving wall, and he simply drifted through empty air, unable to control his direction, but no longer being tossed about. He took a deep, gasping breath, trying to steady himself as he floated. His heart was pounding, and he could feel each beat in his chest like a thunderclap. He was still bleeding from the stumps of his arms, and he felt weak and worn. But he was alive. He tucked his stumps under his armpits in an attempt to staunch the bleeding, gritting his teeth at the pain. His mind raced, trying to figure out what to do next. The gentle breeze of the current tickled his face, distracting him. It felt nice. After all that had happened, it was comforting to be here again, in the place that he loved the most. Maybe he could figure this out after all. Even if he had lost both of his hands, his empire still remained. He was the king of the world. He was God. He would not let something like the loss of his members destroy him. He would fight. He would... The winds called to him. The song was sweet and seductive, and consisted only of the touch of air on his cheek and the sound of the current passing by his ears. Maybe he didn't have to go back after all. This was his favorite place. Couldn't he just float here and forget? It would be so easy to just lose himself here. His eyes went wide as he realized what was happening to him. This was always the danger of entering the winds. You could glide along without a care in the world, but the longer you stayed, the more you never wanted to leave. In his weakened state, delirious from blood loss, he was especially vulnerable to the call to just surrender that was filling his mind. He tried to wrestle free from it. He had to stay in control. He couldn't lose himself now, after he had managed to make it this far. He had kept going after his wife had betrayed him. He had built an empire for himself. He had destroyed his treacherous children. He had bested Tarwa. He had escaped hell itself with only one hand. He couldn't just lose now. He couldn't. But why did he even want to go back in the first place? What could Mother Earth possibly hold for him that he couldn't find here? The wealth that he had accumulated over years and years? He didn't need that. It had never been about the money for him. There was no one he cared about on the other side. Caring was only a weakness anyway. He'd always preferred being alone. He was alone here. The only thing he truly wanted was control. To be able to master his own destiny. To guide the ship of fate. To never be powerless again. Manulf gritted his teeth. No, he couldn't have control here. Not without his hands. He couldn't guide himself on the currents. But how would he get back? He had to try something. He had to escape somehow. Rest, the winds called to him. There is no need to worry. Everything you could ever want is here. Freedom, peace, floating forever in my embrace. Manulf cursed, taking his arms from beneath his armpits and clawing ineffectually at the air in front of him with his stumps. He tried to steer himself as he floated in the void, pushing towards a stronger current he knew was nearby, but he was just carried on by the bare trickle of air he was currently caught in, and his flailing seemed to make no difference. It couldn't end like this. It couldn't. He had to escape. He could do it. He just had to find a way. He always had before. Sleep. Manulf sobbed, a tearless sob, as he tried to do something. Anything. Reflexively, hopelessly, he reached out with what would have been his fingers, trying to pry a hole in space. But he had no fingers. He had no hands. And the little Voldmite that remained in him only helped him realize more completely just how doomed he was. It turned out he had nothing at all. Only pain, where the instruments of his strength had once existed. Only loss, where he once thought he had gained so much. He reached out with one bleeding stump. Towards what? Who? He didn't know. It's time to stop fighting, the winds whispered to him. It's time to let go. Manulf went limp, feeling his body bob in the current like the bloated carcass of a fish. The tension in his body eased, and his muscles relaxed as he was enveloped in the beautiful song surrounding him. He felt himself fading away. And then, finally, his grip loosened on his own fate, and he lost all control. Acknowledgements. There are quite a few people to acknowledge in the making of this short story. First, to Michael J. Sullivan and the folks who wrote for and edited the Blackguards anthology back in 2014 and 2015. The Kickstarter they ran for the anthology included a stretch goal that allowed writers to submit a story for the anthology for a chance to get included. I started one story and scrapped it, but my second attempt was what would become Spend a Winter in Hell, and for that, I am eternally grateful. I never did submit it because I didn't finish before the deadline, but this story is one that has stayed with me through the years after the contest, always in the back of my mind, waiting for the day I would return to it. Finally, in November 2017, I did. I read the portion I had finished aloud on the podcast I do with my brother and our friend Carly, and asked for help writing the ending. The feedback they gave me was invaluable in finishing a first draft of the story. I also need to thank the writing group in my capstone writing workshop my senior year of college at UW-Whitewater. I submitted this story to them and they fell in love with it like I had, and gave me so many great suggestions to make it even better. Without their enthusiasm and expertise, this story would be much worse off. Lastly, I want to thank my first patrons, Josh Vincent, Carly Pinch, and Ethan Stoltzfus, for their support on Patreon, the impetus for me releasing this story in the first place. These three have been some of my biggest fans over the years, in all my endeavors, and they were the first to be there for me when I took this next step in my creative work. This concludes the reading of Spend a Winter in Hell, written by Caleb M. Powers, read by the author. Thanks for listening.